Hi, I'm William Malik with a bit of security for today, the 3rd of December. We're going to be talking a bit about the foundations of identity management. If you're going to turn an art into a science, it's incumbent on you to discover some of the fundamental principles. That's what science is about, discovering fundamental principles. That's what engineering is about, finding what the axioms are that underline the manifest behavior of a system. So we're going to take a look at an axiom for identity management. Identity management is a complex topic. It's got two parts. When I first began covering identity management at Gartner, I realized there were two problems that were related. They were mirror images, actually. The first problem was the perspective of the user. Okay, here I am, I'm a user. I've got all these applications. I have different IDs. I have different methods to authenticate myself to them. And so the problem I have is the single sign-on problem. I'd like to do something to simplify, to reduce the number of times I have to log on to these various systems. The problem with a single sign-on problem is very hard to solve. First of all, you come from many different platforms. Users run on all sorts of things, even back then, and you're connecting to applications that have many different types. This was before the age when we had any kind of API for authentication or identification. So you basically had to take whatever the vendor of the app had put together and use that as a way to get in. There were some solutions that ran on the individual PC. There were some solutions that attempted manually to link, this desktop with that application. And then in release 2, they'd add this second application. And so they were looking for what are the most popular desktops, which ones are growing, what are the most popular apps, what does everybody need to get to? And the problem was it took years before we had an API. And essentially, there was no business case, right? For something to be a viable product, you got to have a pervasive problem. You've got to have an urgent problem. And you have to have somebody who's willing to pay to solve that problem. So when you try to build a business case for single sign-on, you end up getting into these ridiculous things like, say, oh my gosh, we have 200,000 employees here. And this solution will save 30 seconds per employee. So, my God, man, across the organization, that's 100,000 minutes every day. If over a 250-day year, that comes down to 8,000 person years of savings. Yeah. The fact is, when you try to aggregate fractions of a person's time, you got to remember to round down, right? You can't take a minute from me and a minute from them and a minute from each of them and come up with an hour of savings. It just doesn't scan. So although everybody was a little irritated by having to sign on, except in a few truly pathological cases, I know one guy who had 150 user IDs and passwords he needed to get his daily job done. Nobody's going to buy it. The problem's pervasive, but it's not urgent, and there's nobody who's going to sign a check because there's no organization to which that savings would accrue. Now, one small step forward in solving single sign-on was the advent of the web SSO products, web single sign-on. They came out, they were very quickly gobbled up. DASCOM went to IBM, e-commerce went to Entrust, Securant went to RSA, and Integrity was acquired by Computer Associates. That all happened within like 18 months. So that's the one side of the story, the user looking at this multitude of applications. The other side of the story, the mirror image, is the administrator over here who never met the user, but knows that there's a whole swath of applications in the middle that are associated with a user. And that when that user's role changes, when they retire or take a promotion or leave for another job, get dismissed, what have you, something has to happen to all of those promotions. So it's the mirror image of the single sign-on problem, and we called it the consolidated user administration problem, which never had much of a, what you would say, traction as a buzzword in the market. The thing is, with consolidated administration, the problem is pervasive and it is urgent because if something goes wrong there, now you have people with permissions to stuff they shouldn't get. I've mentioned in prior podcasts the problem with Barings Bank, where Nick Leeson, over a period of years, accrued more and more permissions and was able to invest tremendous amounts of money on the bank's behalf and then lose it, and the bank went bankrupt. So we need to see what we can do with this axiom that there are symmetries underlying identity and access management. Transforming that insight into a product gave us the whole identity governance domain. Because the problem here isn't the perspective of the user or the perspective of the administrator. It's this swath of permissions and the necessary separation of duties rules, the ways to manage transitions that'll both help the user and the administrator, the ways you need to inform compliance, the ways you need to deal with exceptions when they happen. These key issues are as important to the business as managing money, inventory, and intellectual property. Knowing that there is a conceptual symmetry underlying these tasks makes deploying the solution easier, it's rational, it's verifiable, and it's practical because it'll fit with your organization's information architecture. In other words, identity management is a valid concept. We'll take a look at some others. Imagine how simple it would be if artificial intelligence had some such common conceptual understanding that allowed us to deploy it rationally, verifiably, practically across the enterprise. So think about the engineering foundations of the discipline you're in. That's our bit of security for Tuesday, the 3rd of December. I'm Bill Malik. Be safe.